Hello, everyone. My name's Kayla. If you haven't already met me or watched any of my videos, I am a tutor and I typically will be tutoring anatomy in what are called group tutoring sessions. And while I am not able to be in person for a few sessions, I'm going to be recording videos so that you guys can still watch and still review this stuff with some material and a point of view that's other than your own. And hopefully, I can expand on some of the things that you're learning, as well as just point out things that may be a little difficult to remember and try and give you guys some ideas of other ways to remember them. So, today I'm going to focus on the axial skeleton. And so, I have a little presentation that I'll use to show you images. And yeah, that's pretty much how we'll do it. I also have a couple of links that hopefully I'll be able to share with you in one way or another, which will have some 2D models, but interactive 2D models of the human skeleton as a whole, as well as the skull, which I think will be really helpful for you guys to study both of those structures. So to get me started, I'm going to share my screen so that all of you guys can see. Here we go. So we have the axial skeleton, as I already mentioned. And so there are 206 bones in the human body, but the axial skeleton contains 80. And so they are categorized into these three general categories. So you have the skull, you have cranial bones, and some facial bones. Then you have your vertebral column, and then you have your ribs and your sternum. So to start off, I'm going to start with the skull. And so this is an image, it's taken directly from your lab manual, and this goes over a lot of the bones that you need to remember. There's a lot of wording here, which can be a little bit scary when you're first looking at it, but overall, the skull, once you understand and know all of the bones, it's going to be a lot easier. And some of these bones are also helpful because some of them correlate to structures of the brain. And so it'll be very helpful to remember some of these regions. So the first bone that we can see right here, smack dab in the middle, where your forehead is the frontal bone, and that correlates with the frontal region, which should hopefully help you remember it a little bit better. And so the frontal bone has two structures that you'll want to remember. You have the supraorbital ridge, which is kind of right here, and that's where your eyebrow sits. And so it is a little bit elevated to also have your eyebrow there to protect your eye, specifically from sweat and other things. Um, and then you also have your supraorbital foramen, which these are little holes right here, and you have one on each side. And these allow blood vessels and nerves to go through, specifically to go to your face, because you have a lot of you have your skin, you have muscles, everything on top of your skull. And so those holes allow the blood vessels to come out to those superficial structures. And then off of your frontal bone, you have your zygomatic bone. And the zygomatic bone, you can see here, you have the, where is it? I don't think it's pictured very well here. I believe you have your zygomatic arch, which is about here. And I will go over it in a different picture where you have that more, you can see it a little bit more. It's visible. But it's basically a V shape of the zygomatic bone. And typically people know the zygomatic bone is the cheekbone because it creates a good chunk of your cheek. Your zygomatic bone then connects to the maxilla, and in your maxilla, you have a couple of different areas. So you have your infraorbital foramen, which means under the eye, and they're also going to allow for various blood vessels and nerves to go through and go to the superficial structures. And then you also have the alveolar processes, which are going to be right here, and they're going to connect your teeth to your gums, or yeah, the top of your teeth to your gums. And then if you go back up towards the top of the skull, you have your nasal bone. And so the nasal bone is here in blue. I don't believe there are any structures, or I don't believe there are any, not structures, but I don't think there are any specific, it's called features that are on the nasal bone. Um, and so that's pretty much all of these structures here that all connect. There are more structures that connect, but for now, those are all of them. And then if we want to go back into the nose, so you have the vomer. This is this little tiny section in blue, and the vomer is what's going to um, form the inferior nasal septum. So it's going to be the lower nasal septum. And then you have the inferior nasal concha, which will form the superior nasal septum. And so for you guys, I believe you only really need to remember the vomer, but remembering the inferior nasal concha can also be helpful. And then now going to the orbits or the eyes, you have right here, you have the lacrimal bone. And it's a little difficult to see here. I will also go over it in the or technically I think it's 3D model, but obviously it's 2D because we're just looking at it. So the lacrimal bone, the way I like to remember it, and it's mainly because I do my makeup, and so anyone else who does makeup might also relate to this. The lacrimal bone is kind of where you'd apply concealer. It's kind of right here. It's still kind of where your eye lies, but not quite. It's like the very like innermost part of the eyelid. And a lot of people also associate it with the lacrimal glands, which are going to be either um, producing or kind of absorbing tears. So the lacrimal bone, you can kind of remember it's where your tear duct is. And then behind or deep to the lacrimal bone, you have the ethmoid bone. So you can see it a little bit here. You can also see it in other areas. The ethmoid bone also has a couple of features, but they're not very visible here. So I have another image to go over it. So you can see those features, but the ethmoid bone is going to also create the orbit. And then here's just an extension of the maxilla, and then an extension of the zygomatic bone. And then back here, you have the sphenoid bone. This specific section is the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. And you can see here it's in bright pink. You can also see it's on the outside of this skull as well. So it goes all the way from this outside to the inside of the orbit. And then in the orbits, you have two fissures. And so fissures are these basically holes, and they are going to allow the optic nerve and various other blood vessels to go from your eye into your through your skull into your brain. And so this is the superior orbital fissure and the inferior orbital fissure. And then lastly, what we can see here is the mandible. The mandible is your jaw. And so some features of the mandible that will be good to remember is the mental foramen, and those are going to be in your mental region, and they're also going to allow nerves and blood vessels through. Then you also have some other features, but they're not very, you have I think the only other ones, yeah, you don't need to really remember much other than the alveolar sockets, which are going to be what connect the bottom row of teeth to your gums. And there will be other parts to look at when we get to other images. And so The next thing I want to talk about is the various sutures. And so the sutures, you have various ones, you have small ones in between a lot of your different bones in your skull. But the main ones we talk about and you learn about is the coronal, sagittal, squamous, and lambdoidal sutures. And so I'm going to show you them in this image here. So you have the coronal suture, which here we have a side profile of it, but if you had a frontal profile or a frontal profile, you'd see this coronal suture goes exactly with the coronal plane, and it goes all the way across the top of your frontal bone, and it connects your frontal bone to what is known as your parietal bone. And technically, you have two parietal bones. You have one on each side. And then from there, you have the squamous suture, and it's named that way because of the shape of the suture, kind of similar to squamous epithelial cells. So this squamous suture is going to surround and connect your temporal bone to your parietal bone. And then you have your lambdoidal suture. Let me see if I can find a better image to show your lambdoidal. Okay, I don't. So your lambdoidal suture, I will use the other image to or the 3D model will help you visualize it. The lambdoidal suture, lambdoid means triangle or triangular, and so from the back, it looks a little bit like a triangle, and that is connecting your parietal and your temporal bones to your occipital bone, which is the very back of your skull. And so some of the features of these various bones that I've pointed out, the parietal, occipital, and temporal bones, some of the features of these bones I'll go over real quick. So the parietal bones don't really have any significant features. The temporal bone, though, has quite a few features on it. The first one here is the zygomatic process, and that's what's kind of going to be a little bit back. It connects from your ear to your zygomatic bone or your cheekbone. So that's this right here. And as you can see in this image, this is the zygomatic process. And so that's going to connect those two structures. And then you have the mandibular fascia, which is going to be, I believe, right here. And it's where the mandible is going to connect to the temporal bone. You also have the mastoid process, which is this little, almost pyramid-like shape coming out below your ear. And so you can feel it behind your ear if you kind of palpate that area with your finger. You also have the styloid process, which is this little, almost like pickaxe-like shape that comes out from your ear or from behind your ear as well. It also kind of looks like a tooth, like a vampire or werewolf tooth. And it's a point for ligaments and muscles to attach to the neck. Then the last structure, the last feature that you have here is the external acoustic meatus, and this is going to be the actual hole, essentially, of your ear. And so this acoustic or auditory meatus is the hole. It's the canal that leads from the outer ear to the middle and inner ear. And then, let's see, where is the occipital bone? Ah. So now I'm going to go to this image or model of the skull. So you can see here, this one you can move around, which is going to be very helpful for studying. And so as I mentioned earlier, so you have the frontal bone here, then you have the parietal, the temporal, and then the occipital bone. And so this occipital bone, you can see here the lambdoidal suture, which looks like a triangle, and then another suture that I did not mention before was the sagittal suture, and this is because it lies sagittally, kind of like where you would part your hair if you do a middle part. And so, sorry, some features of the occipital bone that I want to show you is for the foramen magnum, which essentially just means large hole. And this large hole is going to be the hole that your spinal cord is going to go through, and then the vertebrae are going to attach very closely, and they will be attaching to the occipital condyles. So these are the bulges, the anterior bulges, which are the occipital condyles, which will connect to the C1 vertebrae. So that's going to be your first cervical vertebrae, also known as the atlas. And then there's a couple other features of the mandible that I wanted to go over that I wasn't able to in the other one. So obviously you have the mental foramen right there. You also have the mandibular notch. So that is the curve right here where the jaw connects to the skull. You also have the mandibular condyle, which is this process off of the mandibular notch that connects to the mandibular fascia of the temporal bones, which you can see right there. And then you have the coronoid process, which is the anterior process of the notch. And those were the ones I was not able to go over earlier. I believe, the ethmoid bone is the last one that I'll have to go over, and the sphenoid. I'll show some structures there, but for now, I'm just going to go over all the bones I've already mentioned. So we have the frontal bone, and then here you can see in a lot more detail, you can see the frontal bone, you can see it extends into the orbit, and then once you get in the orbit, you have the lacrimal bone right here, and then right here, you can see a lot more of the ethmoid bone, which is going to also be part of the structure of the orbit. Then you have the maxilla right here, and that's also forming this section of the orbit. You have your zygomatic bone, which is this section of the orbit. And then I'm trying to get the right angle. Right here, you can see the sphenoid bone, and you can also see here the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. And these lightened portions right here are the superior and inferior fissures. And then off of the orbits, you also have the nasal bone here. Then again, you can see a little bit of the sphenoid bone on this side as well. You have the temporal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, and see there are two parietal and there are two temporal bones. And then you have, it's harder to see here, but you do have the vomer here, and the inferior nasal concha. And then you have the mandible. And then you can still see all of the different processes. You can see the acoustic or auditory meatus. You can see obviously I already went over the foramen magnum, the mental foramen, the superior orbital ridge. You can't really see the foramen as well, but they are there too. And so let me go back to the slideshow to show you, see some of these structures. You have here's another image of the vomer, and you can see the sphenoid bone. You can see the foramen magnum and the condyles of the occipital bone. And you can see some other structures as well in this image. Here we go. Here is the sphenoid bone. So you have a few different images taken from different directions of the sphenoid bone. So one of the biggest things you need to remember about the sphenoid bone is that you have the sella tertia. It's also known as the Turkish saddle. And this is what holds I believe the pituitary gland. It holds the pituitary gland. I always get that and the pineal gland mixed up, so I wanted to make sure. Sella tertia, or Turkish saddle, holds the pituitary gland. And then you have the greater wing, and then you have the lesser wing, which kind of looks like a manta ray and a little bit like a butterfly as well. And then with the ethmoid bone, this one you can see in this image, it forms a little bit of the orbit as well as the internal structures in the nose. And so the two structures you need to remember for the ethmoid bone is the crista galli, which is right here, which is also known as the rooster's comb, and it secures the brain within the skull. You also have the cribiform plate underneath the crista galli, and this is the portion of the roof of the nasal cavity and anterior floor of the cranial fascia. I believe those are all the main important bones and structures, or I always say structures, bones and features of all the bones you need to remember in the skull. And feel free to rewind this video and go over it as many times as you need to just study and go over these bones. I also want to provide the link to the model so you can use that as well. And here's a larger image with the different colors to see the walls of the orbit. So next, I'm going to go over the vertebral column. So the vertebral column consists of, I believe, about 33 vertebrae. And I'll get into the different categories they are in. As you can see here, there is the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccyx vertebrae. So the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar are the main vertebrae that we talk about because they have individual vertebrae. Whereas when you get to the sacrum and the coccyx, the sacrum has 5 fused vertebrae, as you can see here, and the coccyx has 4 fused vertebrae, and they are very small compared to all the other vertebrae. So one easy way to remember the amount of vertebrae within each section is by thinking of the time of day you eat. So this doesn't apply to every person, but if you think of breakfast, an easy time to think of breakfast is at 7 a.m. So the first part of the vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae, would be at breakfast time, and you'll have 7 a.m. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae. And then typically you would eat lunch at around 12. So your thoracic vertebrae are going to be at lunchtime at 12 o'clock. So you have the 12 thoracic vertebrae. And then you usually eat dinner around, let's say, 5 o'clock. And so you can remember your lumbar vertebrae have 5 because it's around 5 o'clock. So you have 7 a.m. breakfast, 12 p.m. you have lunch, and then 5 p.m. you have dinner. And so those are an easy way to remember 7, 12, 5. So 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. And typically they're categorized as C 1 through 7, T 1 through 12, and L 1 through 5. And then the sacral vertebrae, since they're fused, they don't really have individual numbers, and same with the coccyx. So if someone is going to ask what vertebrae lies inferior to the foramen magnum, it would be the C1 vertebrae. And while you don't need to remember each individual vertebrae and what they look like, knowing generally how many vertebrae are in each section and where you could find them on a skeleton is very helpful. And then this is a larger image of an individual vertebrae. And while not every vertebrae is going to look exactly like this is a general layout of vertebrae. So you have let's start with the body. So you have the body, which is this large section, and that's going to be the deeper section of the vertebrae. And then off of the body, you have a pedicle on each side. And you can see it's this large portion here. And this is where it's going to create space for nerves to come off of your spinal cord. And then from the pedicle, you also have the lamina. So the pedicle is going to attach the body of the vertebrae to the lamina, and then the lamina is going to attach the vertebral, the transverse processes to the spinous processes. So then, like I said, this would be your transverse process, and you have one on each side. And then the lamina is in between those transverse processes and the spinous process, which this is your spine essentially, and that's going to be the posterior portion of the vertebrae, and that's going to be what you see when you look at the spine on your back. And then the lamina and the body of the vertebrae are going to create a foramen, which is called your vertebral foramen. And this is where your spinal cord will lie. And so, as you can see, the spinal cord will be surrounded by bone, which is really helpful because your spinal cord is very, very sensitive. And so we want to make sure that it doesn't get damaged. And that's why you also have the intervertebral discs, which are made of your fibrocartilage, which will also be in between each vertebrae. Next, we have the ribs and the sternum. So the ribs, you have 12 ribs. So they're categorized, as you can see here, into true ribs and false ribs. And so the true ribs are ribs 1 through 7. The false ribs are 8 through 12. As you can see here, you also have 2 floating ribs, and those are your 11th and 12th ribs. And the reason they're called this way is because your true ribs are easily attached to the sternum. You can see here with 8, 9, and 10, they're all attached to one part of the hyaline cartilage or the costal cartilage that will then connect to more cartilage that will then connect to the sternum. So they don't connect directly, and so they would be considered false ribs because they don't directly connect to the sternum. And then the floating ribs are categorized as floating ribs because they don't have any costal cartilages to connect to the sternum. And then the sternum itself is categorized into 3 sections. So you have the xiphoid process, which is technically made up of the costal cartilage, and then you have the body of the sternum, and then you have the menebrium or menebrium. Yeah, menebrium. And those 3 sections are what make up the sternum. And on this menebrium, you have the jugular notch and the clavicle notch. And the clavicle notch is what's going to connect to the clavicle bone. And the jugular notch is somewhat near where your jugular veins will be and where they will enter into your superior vena cava. And I believe that is most of what the axial skeleton, that's most of what you need to know. Oh, I think I missed one section. So I mentioned before the atlas, which is your C1 vertebrae. Your C2 vertebrae is known as the axis, and it's a pivot point for rotation of the atlas, which is your first vertebrae coming off of or attaching to the skull. Your axis, so your C2, is known as a little neck also. And I believe that is all that you need to remember for that's all you need to remember for your axial skeleton. And I will show you let me to hit escape. I'll show you as well. This is the model for the complete skeleton. And so you can use this to kind of look at, you can see where the costal cartilage meets the actual ribs. You can see the different sections of the sternum. You can see here, you can see the vertebrae and then the intervertebral discs. And then you can see a lot of other structures that I will go over when I go through the appendicular skeleton, which will be next. So thank you for watching this, and I will try to include a link to each of these in the caption of my video. So thank you for watching, and again, feel free to go through this video as many times as you need, and if you have any comments or questions, you can always leave a comment on the video. You can also email me. I have my email linked, or not linked. I have it on the screen at the very end of the first video I made. So you can go back to that. It should all be on the same YouTube page. Thank you guys so much. I hope this helped you.